Okay, so good afternoon, and this is the closing module about the models in open economies, basically. So where we are trying to explain the relationship between globalization, international trade, and development. Okay, so last time we have been studying the traditional models, where we basically learn how traditional models emphasize that countries are characterized by certain resource endowments, and that therefore, because of the specific resource endowments, they should decide to produce certain goods rather than others. Okay, so those goods that allow them to use efficiently their production factors, those in which they are abundant. Okay, and so we are seeing how traditional models basically reflect a sort of deterministic view about what countries should produce. Okay, so what countries should specialize in. Okay, and then we have seen also other approaches from the more modern, let's say, theories, where we started talking about the role of expectations, the need of coordination among actors in order to foster development, and so on. Okay, so this is the starting point where we ended last time. Okay, so what we are going to do today, we are going to illustrate some of the more recent approaches to development. Okay, and in particular, what we are now going to illustrate is the approaches suggested by these economists. Daniel Rodriguez, very well-known economist, based in the US, but is from Turkey originally, very, very well-known, where the basic idea is that underdevelopment could be explained by a sort of information problem. Okay, so what does it mean? Information problem refers to the fact that less developed countries do not know what is better for them. Or said in a different way, they do not know what is in principle, a priori, okay, ex ante, the best production, the best sector, the best products that should be produced in the country. Okay, so here, as you can see, it is a big difference with the traditional models that we have seen last time. Because according to the traditional model, countries know about their production factors and therefore decide what to produce. Okay? Here, the perspective is completely different. So, they start by emphasizing that, in principle, you don't know what you are should try to explore, okay? You should try to find out what you are good at, okay? And so this is really a different perspective, okay? Where the idea is that, therefore, there should be basically two important stages, and the role of government here is crucial, okay? Because in the first stage, okay, of development, countries should be allowed to explore, okay? So exploring what is best for the country itself, okay? So then we'll see how, okay? In the second stage, instead, the government should try to rationalize, because if in the exploration stage, okay, you allow several activities to start, okay, just to explore, then you will have a very diversified production, so several sectors, and is not efficient to leave all of them, okay, going on, because resources are limited, and therefore it will be very crucial to decide which is the main sector, okay, in which it will be more effective, more efficient to specialize. Okay, so two stages. The first one is exploration. Second one is rationalization. Okay, and so this work, as you can see, is relatively recent. I mean, about 20 years, okay, a couple of decades. Danny Rodriguez has been advisor, of course, of the several international institutions, of the US government, and so on. And in particular, okay, the three building blocks of the approach, I wouldn't call it theory, but the building blocks of this approach basically refer to what we just said. So, in the first stage, you need, therefore, to try to, I'm coming back in that here, to foster exploration, meaning you should try to incentivize entrepreneurship, initiatives from locals, in order to see what is flourishing rather than what is going to fail. Okay, but you need to experiment. You need to allow local entrepreneurship. Okay, and therefore you need to invest in local entrepreneurship, okay, in order to foster the first stage. Okay. Why? Because there is uncertainty, as we said. There is uncertainty about what is better. Okay? There is uncertainty. There are several examples. Here, the example that is mentioned is the success. The Indian success in IT was not expected because based on the resource endowment, it was not predictable, okay? And also, there are different countries that perhaps present similar resource endowments, but then they develop different models, different specializations, okay? And therefore, is not clear, example, why a certain specialization should work better in country A than in country B when they have similar specialization. So Bangladesh efficiency in producing arts, I don't know, and Pakistan efficiency and success in producing other kind of textiles. Okay, so in principle, you do not have any reason, okay, to expect that. So uncertainty is the first element. The second element that we will also find in the following approaches that we'll see today is that even if we know that technology could be considered, I mean, a sort of public good, as we said, at least after a while, because we know that patents expire and so on, technology is rarely something that you can take out of the shelf and just adapt to your context. Okay? There is a need of adaptation. Okay? And so, is not, how can I say, you cannot rely on foreign technology, okay, in order to foster development, because the adaptation of foreign technology to the local context is not, say, something that is always easy to implement. Okay? So why are we saying that? Because what Daniel is emphasizing is that there should be intervention from the government. Okay? So the laissez-faire policy cannot work. Okay? Why? Because there is uncertainty, because foreign technology, although available, might not be implemented and adopted and used in the local context without specific investments. Okay? So, Daniel suggests several examples, of course, but if you think, I don't know, something like even in sectors like the agricultural ones, okay? Producing corn is rather, easy. In several countries, you can produce corn, okay? However, when you consider the pesticides and the products that make the corn crop resistant, what you find, and looking at the data about patents, you find that most of the biotech patents, okay, that should somehow save, okay, the crops are designed or are related to innovations against pests that are common in the US, in Europe, but not in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And there are thousands of patents in biotech for, say, making the crops resistant to European and US kind of pests, okay, but not for sub-Saharan Africa. So he was illustrating some data, and he found thousands of patents and against EU and US pests, and just 5 patents against the worm that was common in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and so this is to say that technology, okay, is not always applicable to the less developed countries' context. Okay, and so the government, the investments should be addressed towards the adaptation of foreign technology. Okay, so another example is the development of the shipbuilding industry in South Korea. Okay, in the 70s, there was an investment by the government to develop this industry. Okay, the shipbuilding industry, and therefore the government invested in buying licenses. okay? Because, of course, the technology was patented, and therefore, to get the technology, you need to buy a license, okay? But that was not enough. So several people, personnel, employees, were sent abroad to learn, to acquire competencies, okay, as a further investment in technology. Because you cannot simply buy a license, okay? Because then you don't know how to adapt your technology, how to use the new technology, and so on. Okay? And so this is the second element that in this approach, that by the way is called self-discovery. Okay? So the country has to invest in order to find out what is good at. Okay? And the third point that they emphasize is that the government should also care about possible events like imitations. What does it mean? The example is the sector that I think in the 70s, it was in the 70s, really became very important in Colombia, okay? But that was because an American entrepreneur started this business, just investing $100,000 in the cut flowers sector, and then in less than 20 years, he became incredibly rich, okay? And that stimulated a lot of imitation in the country, and after a couple of decades, there were more than 250 firms in the sector, okay? So is that good or not? On the one hand, it might be good because it was an exploration, okay, about a sector that could be successful in the country. But on the other hand, this reduced the incentive to explore more, okay? And so there should be, again, an intervention, a monitoring from the government, okay, in order to keep stimulating, okay, the exploration of successful activities, of successful sectors. Is that clear? Okay, so the laissez-faire, so the market, cannot be the solution. According with this model, the government, okay, and in fact, if you see where Danny Rodrigue is based, okay, he works, of course, at the JFK School of Government at Harvard, okay, emphasizing, of course, the role of government, okay, as really, really crucial for any development action, okay? The second approach suggested, of course, related to the first one, is 2006, so okay, not much later, is an approach where they suggest a step further, okay? So, once you acknowledge, okay, that economic growth is what you need for development, and this is the starting point in these models, in these approaches. So, if you remember, mentioned several times that economic growth is just a partial view of development, okay? So we might critically deal with this model, okay? But if we accept, as they do, that economic growth is the needed starting point to trigger development, okay, what you need is to, not surprisingly, try to detect what is the constraint, what is the main problem, okay, that reduce the possibility of growing, okay? So, what does it mean? It does mean that the government should not try to implement the highest number of reforms, the highest number of changes, okay, as has been done in several countries, especially in Latin America. But the government should focus, okay, because resources are limited, okay, on the most binding constraint, meaning should focus on the bottlenecks, okay, that hinder economic growth. Okay, so it's not surprisingly so, because the idea here is that we know from the economic theory, from the models, that economic growth depends on several factors. Okay, we know that economic growth depends, according with all the models that we have seen, savings, for example, okay, internal savings, crucial. Depends on R&D, depends on knowledge, internal knowledge, depends on infrastructure, okay? So we have several elements that suggest what are the factors that could trigger or instead avoid, okay, the development, economic growth. And therefore, what you need here is to try to understand, okay, what is the key factor, the most important, the bottlenecks. Okay, and therefore, once you identify that, the government should set a list of priorities and focus on them rather than trying to act in several directions. Okay, because in the end, you need to focus and remove the binding constraints. Okay, and this is to say that, and this is really the motto, let's say, of their approaches, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach when you deal with development or underdevelopment. Okay, so in each case, in each country, in each region, you need to focus on the specific situation, on the specific conditions, on the factors that relate to growth. Okay? And so this is, I think, what I just said. So you should avoid the approach that has been seen in the past in several countries, that is, we should reform. Any reform is good. we need to change the existing situation. Okay? So whatever is fine. The more we implement reforms, the better. The deeper the reform, the better. Okay? So this is fault. This is not going to work. On the contrary, they emphasize you should focus on removing the distortion, removing the failures in the path towards economic growth. And this is the logic. Okay? In order to do that, what they suggest is the following diagnostic tree, they call it. Very simple. This is an example where they start from, for example, the factor related to low investments, the low savings, okay, and therefore the low investments in the country. Okay, so they identify a possible problematic factor in fostering economic growth. So we know that savings is important. Why? Because savings mean investments, and we know that investments lead to growth. Okay? So here they start from trying to identify what are the reasons that could be related to low investments and entrepreneurship. Okay? Entrepreneurship means investment. Okay? And so here they distinguish several possible determinants, several possible causes, and they analyze, on the one hand, okay, why there might be low investment and entrepreneurship. Perhaps because the money is too expensive, okay, so high cost. It's difficult for entrepreneurs finding the money that are needed to start. Okay, and so I already mentioned previously the well-known work by the banker in Bangladesh, I think it was, Yunus, that won the Nobel Prize, the banchiere dei poveri, so the banker of the poor, okay, where the idea was to help very poor people to start entrepreneurial activities. Sometimes it's not that much that you need, but you need to start, okay? And so here, the high cost, the difficulty in accessing the needed, okay, sum to start the activity is a binding constraint, okay? And so once you get there, then you have, again, other possible, okay, causes. On the other hand, okay, there might be the determinants, that is, even if I invest, the return is so low that this is not incentivizing investments. Okay? So, on the one hand is the access to finance. On the other hand is, even if I invest, I get not enough. And so it's not worthy starting entrepreneurial activities. Is that clear, the difference? Okay. And so when you are talking about the low return, that could be due to several reasons. Okay. So, for example, even if I invest Okay? I might not be able to appropriate the return from my initiative. Why? Let's suppose the simplest case is the innovation, of course. Okay, I introduced an innovative product, an innovative process, but then there is no protection of my intellectual property, and therefore, why should I invest if I sustain a cost to develop products and processes, and then I cannot appropriate the return? Okay. But also sometimes people in agricultural sectors cannot appropriate the return because then there are intermediaries that exploit them and pay them very little for their products and so on. Okay? So there are, of course, several reasons that you could explore and that refer to market failures, social failures, with institutions, and so on. So for each factor, so here low savings and low investment, you could further disaggregate, okay, the possible reasons. So how to do that, of course, is the critical issue. Okay. What they suggest is that in order to find out, you need data, of course. You need empirical investigation. You need to be there and really analyze what is going on. Okay? You cannot really produce a nice tree like that is, I mean, just an elegant kind of picture, but then you need to really detect where is the critical, okay, binding constraint for the country. Okay? And in fact, there are several examples that they suggest. The most well known is the analysis of some Central and Latin American countries, okay? And in particular, they analyze Brazil, El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic. So if some of the groups here are working on these countries, it might be useful to take a look at this work. Why? Because what they observe is that these countries present, look at the table. So the table reports the GDP growth rate, okay, from the 80s to beginning of the year 2000s, okay? And what they show, basically, is that if you look at the trends, say, there are two countries that report kind of a weak growth, okay? While the Dominican Republic reported the highest growth in that period, okay? And there is a comparison with the OECD countries, so the developed ones, and the US, okay? So this is also something that you could produce in your report, okay? So when you compare the growth rate, okay, over time of your country with other countries, this could be done with other countries in the same region, okay? But also with more developed countries, so the OECD is, of course, a useful categorization, or the US, right? And what we observe, and what they observe here, is that the two countries that report the weaker growth are, Brazil and El Salvador, are those countries in which, in that period, there were implemented the highest number of reforms. Okay? While in El Salvador, that instead report the highest growth trend, okay, the best growth trend among those, there were only few reforms, okay, but very much focused, okay. And so when they have been asked to work on the development, so on the possible development of policies and measures for these countries, okay, they analyzed, okay, carefully what was going on in the three countries. So what happened? So there is this case, El Salvador. So it was the adoption of the framework that I just presented. So what they find is that in the case for El Salvador, the main problem was that they were basically suffering a decline in the traditional agricultural and raw material sectors in which they used to be very strong. And so there is of course a description of what they find, you can read it. And the paper is easily, you can find it on the web. I could of course upload it if really somebody is interested. And so they were facing the crisis, the decline in the traditional sectors like cotton, coffee, and so on. And so they really needed new ideas. Okay, so they needed the exploration phase. They needed some help, okay, some support to trigger the exploration phase that we see in the first approach, okay, in order to find new opportunities. And that was really something that was not considered by the government. Of course, promoting entrepreneurship is not easy, okay, because the population, okay, might not have the competencies to become entrepreneurs, okay, and therefore it might be useful to know that the United Nations have this program that is called Empatech, okay. Empatech now is several decades that Empatech is in place, is more than 40 countries, where the idea is a capacity building program, where the idea is to provide education to local people, women in particular, okay, to develop competencies and to develop skills to become entrepreneurs, okay? So, because even if you have a government that is promoting, so you can access some funding, some resources, and so on, it's not that you become entrepreneur like that in overnight. You need competencies, you need skills. And Empatech is the UN program that, one of the programs, but this is the UN program that provides these competencies. I'm particularly care about this program because some years ago we had some master students like you working on master thesis with us and working with MPT in Panama about the program to develop, okay, to design a better program in Panama to say foster and enhance the entrepreneurial activities in Panama. Okay. And by the way, Fulvia Farinelli, who is going to give the seminars in May, for those of you who take the 8 credit course, was part of this program, was leading this program. Okay, so this might be an information. Okay, Brazil. Analyzing Brazil, they found a completely different situation. A situation in which the ideas were set. A lot of entrepreneurial, initiatives in principle, but lack of money, lack of savings. The government was not interested, okay, in promoting the entrepreneurial activities that was needed to trigger again development. And finally, the Dominican Republic was a different case because this Caribbean country had quite, I mean, not strange, but an interesting, let's say, story, as most of the Caribbean countries, because it is interesting that they say the Caribbean is an unlikely place to find a success story. Okay. In particular, in the Dominican Republic, what they faced is that, like in El Salvador case, the traditional sectors were facing a decline, also because they were concentrated in sugarcane and producing sugar cane. And then there was import restrictions in Europe and the US against the sugarcane, and therefore, as we have seen when we have discussed the risk of concentrating in certain agricultural products, okay, what they faced was an incredible decline in the export and therefore in the production of sugarcane. And they had basically nothing else. Luckily, they found a gold mine, okay, I don't remember in which year in particular, but in the 80s, the gold mine became exhausted. And so they had to, again, reinvent themselves. Okay. The situation was a bit different with respect to El Salvador, as here the tourism was one of the sectors that substituted the export of sugarcane, so that could help development of the country. The maquiladoras, if you remember, we mentioned the maquiladoras in Mexico. Do you remember what they are? They are. You don't remember. But maquiladoras refer to assembly plants. Okay, so the maquiladoras refer to big plants from mainly the US, okay, where there are fiscal incentives. In those areas, there are fiscal incentives for exporting, and therefore US companies, for example, in the automotive industry, they localize a lot the assembly plants in Mexico, for example, okay, in order to assemble them and export from them, because there were fiscal advantages in doing that. Okay, and so here there were also something related to the maquiladoras activity, okay, and remittances, so tax haven and fiscal advantages issues. Until at the beginning of the year 2000, there were huge financial scandals, okay, that hit the country. I don't know if you heard about these banks scandals in the country, and the GDP debt increased a lot. And so this is to say, according with Daniel Vick and colleagues, that even if you find a way to explore new sectors, new activities, and so on, then you need institutions that are strong. You need governments that are strong and not corrupted, and so on. And that provides us with an element that allows to move to the next group of models that refer to the key role of institutions in explaining development. Okay? And in particular, development, but also catching up of countries, less developed countries, catching up developed countries. Okay, so let's start from the role of institutions in explaining development, in explaining underdevelopment. Is that clear, Susan? Okay. Okay, so when we talk about institutions in this field, we cannot avoid mentioning this book. This book is quite a recent one. It's 2012. The book is 2012. Written by one of the most well-known economists nowadays, that is Daron Acemoglu. Daron Acemoglu is this guy. Okay. He's at MIT. Who developed, together with some colleagues, the idea, but the idea that institutions might be really determinant, okay, of development. And they consider to almost natural experiments in the economic history, comparing what happened to the two parts of Korea, for example, when they split. Okay, so this is quasi-natural experiments. You start from Korea, one country, they split, okay, in two parts, and institutions are so different there that explain, according with this logic, the different degree of development. The second quasi-experiment that they analyze in this book is the European colonialism, okay, across the world. Okay, and they basically compare different models of colonialism, okay, in different countries. And what they find is that if you look at colonies that were particularly rich in the past, okay, like India, Ghana, Peru, rich of resources, precious materials, and so on, now they have become underdeveloped. While the other way around, they observe that formerly poor colonies, okay, like the US, Canada, New Zealand, and so on, they became the richest countries. Why that? So they observe this empirical context, okay? Korea on the one hand, and colonies, European colonies on the other. And therefore, they distinguish between two different types of institutions. Okay? On the one hand, you can have so-called inclusive institutions, okay? Where institutions refer to both economic institutions, but also political institutions, okay? Economic institutions refer to, as you can see there, the property rights, okay? Not only intellectual property rights, but property rights in general, but also institutions that, okay, foster equality, encourage investments in new technologies, and so on. And then political institutions that are, again, more inclusive, okay, and of course, not corrupt, and so on and so forth. On the other side, they acknowledge the existence of extractive institutions. Those institutions, like the European colonies in Africa, they were aiming at exploit and extract resources. Okay, not say providing beneficial effects on the local context. So, on the one hand, inclusive institutions, on the other hand, extractive institutions. And looking at data, basically, okay, what they suggest is that the inclusive ones determine that the extractive ones in the long term determine underdevelopment and poverty and inequality. Okay? And what they also suggest is that, look at this part at the bottom of the slide. Okay? Institutions are path dependent. You can also say past dependent. Okay? Because basically in fact, they serve hundreds of years. And data along more than a century. Okay? And they observe that there is past dependence. Why? Because let's start from here. Economic performance, okay, depends on economic institutions. Okay? But economic institutions depend, okay, on political institutions. Okay? And you can see political institutions also here, where if you note the index here, time t and time t plus 1, okay, there is a relationship that is path dependence, okay? And in fact, what you have is that political institutions in time t plus 1 depends on political institutions in time t, but also on the political power. Okay? And the political power is not only so-called de jure political power, but is also de facto political power. So there is a distribution of power that depends, okay, on informal kind of relationship and so on. And this impacts political institutions time t plus 1. Okay? And so there is, first of all, a path dependence, but also there is a relationship, the one that I highlighted in red, because this is something that we will see again for those of you that take the 8 credit course in the final part when we study the modeling for assessing the causality. Okay. What we have here is that if you look at the model, there is economic institutions time t, economic performance time t. Okay. So this means that you cannot, and this is a criticism of this model, okay, you cannot assess which is the causality. Because what they are saying is that institutions lead to performances. Bad institutions lead to underdevelopment, good institutions lead to development. Okay? But this is time t on the one side and time t on the other side. So it might also be that it is because there is underdevelopment that institutions are bad, and not the other way around. It is because the economic system is going well that institutions are so good. Okay? So there is an issue here that is the causality issue. So, although they frame their reasoning, that idea, starting from institutions are the determinants of development and underdevelopment, okay, there are some critical views where the comment is, okay, but given the model that you are considering, you cannot assess that, because the causality could be also the opposite. Is that clear? And so there are several empirical models, okay, that try, of course, to test the causality, and results, as we'll see, are well in this. That, of course, it depends and so on. But is that clear, which is the underlying idea of Acemoglu and colleagues? This is really one of the most well-known explanation, let's say, for underdevelopment. Measuring, this is just, I mean, I'm not expecting to read that, but this is just to tell you that when you talk about quality of institutions, so we are talking about good institutions, bad institutions, strong institutions, weak institutions, and so on, how you measure that. Okay? So you might have already seen this data with teaching assistant, I don't know, but this is an index that is very much used to measure, to provide measures for the quality of institutions at the country level over time, because the index is available in different years, of course. And why is that interesting? Okay. You might be curious about the Italian position is in the middle. The first countries being Singapore, Switzerland, and so on. The last ones being Venezuela, North Korea, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and so on. And this is an index that is called economic freedom, but that in fact includes, this is not here. Okay, it's here. Okay. This index includes several indicators that refer to the political and economic institutions that we have mentioned. Okay? So, 4 factors that concur in creating this index. Okay? The factors refer to the rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and the openness of the market. Each of these 4 factors is made up by 3 indexes, okay? And each of these 3 indexes is made up by several indexes. So it's a very complex one, but you can see that there are embedded the economic and political institutions that we have mentioned. Okay, so it is normally adopted as an index for strong institutions, strong quality institutions in the country, rather than weak institutions in the country. Okay, and so it might be useful also for the group who analyze countries along these indicators. Okay, question? Okay. When we want to emphasize the role of institutions, we cannot forget the father, say, of the distinction between formal and informal institutions. What does it mean? While, for example, Darna Cemoglu and colleague, they talk about political and economic institutions, they refer mainly to formal institutions. Okay? So the law, the rule of law, the government policies, the property rights, and so on. Okay? What we cannot forget, and there are studies and theories on that, is that institutions are not only formal institutions. There are also aspects like the religion, culture, customs of people that influence the economic activities and therefore the economic performance and therefore growth. Okay? And so, already the German sociologist Max Weber, back in the 19th century basically, was suggesting that the Industrial Revolution in the UK, in England, was determined by the Protestant ethic, okay, in the UK. And so the devotion to work and so on, okay? So an attitude towards work that was really influential in determining industrial revolution. And so that was among the first economists emphasizing the aspects related to religion, culture, attitudes, customs, and so on. Okay? And so the idea, therefore, in Douglas North's work, that by the way won the Nobel Prize in 1993, for the study of the evolution of institutions, okay, the idea was to emphasize that there are formal and informal institutions, and that they both count, and that you can observe in the data a relationship between the evolution of the economic system and the evolution of formal and informal institutions with data. He was an economic historian working with data, long time serious data, going back to data from the 19th century, okay? And analyzing the relationship between economic change and institutional change. Okay? Very fascinating work. Okay? There are, of course, more recent studies on the role of culture, okay, where culture has been defined in several ways. Okay. You might be familiar with several indexes that have been suggested. The most well-known, I would say, is the Hofstede index. I don't know if you ever met this index. Hofstede. There is a website with all the measures at the country level for different dimensions of culture, but this is just one among the several indexes to provide cross-country cultural measures over time. Okay. That emphasize aspects related to, for example, trust. Okay. And trust, if you think of the models about development that we have seen last week, okay, where we have seen that if there is no trust among the people that should start, okay, the entrepreneurial activity, nobody will start. Okay? Because otherwise they will incur in some cost. Okay? And so trust is a crucial element when talking about development in certain countries. Okay? And so on. There is a wide literature on that. Okay? It is important, however, to emphasize that the studies, the empirical studies, find that, of course, there is not a culture that is superior to another, foster development. Okay? And so this is something to be highlighted. Okay? So there are different cultures, different customs, different religions. They all could lead to development, provided that there are conditions that, of course, concur to trigger development. Is that clear? So this is a particularly important area of development economics, I would say. Okay, is that clear so far? What time is it? Sorry, I have no idea. 20 minutes to 5, okay. So my suggestion would be to try to finish, okay, unless you are that tired. Okay, so we could try to go on and finish earlier. Okay. Within this context, we are the only ones in the okay. Within this context, it is particularly important to mention approaches that have tried to explain catching up. Okay? So what is catching up? We already mentioned that the definition of catching up, I reported there, relates to the ability of a single country to narrow the gap in productivity and income compared to a leader country or the leading group of countries. Okay? So, catching up, therefore, refers to what we have called convergence, basically. Okay? So, countries that somehow, we'll see how, reduce the gap, okay, with leading countries. And of course, most of the theories and the approaches and the explanations that have been suggested refer to what we have already mentioned perhaps last week. That is the possibility of larger countries to benefit from technologies that have been introduced in more developed countries, okay, with no cost, okay, without the need of sustaining of the cost to get the technologies. Okay? So most of the approaches explaining catching up rely on this idea. Okay? On the idea that less developed countries could benefit from the technologies that have been introduced in the more developed world. Okay? However, as we have already mentioned earlier, this is not automatic, okay? Because there is a need for adaptation. And therefore, there is a role that either the government or the market or the civil society should play in order to make this adaptation possible. Okay. And so the hypotheses that we are going to mention differ because they expect different roles that the state, the market, and the civil society should play in order to allow the country to benefit from the technologies that have been introduced in developed countries. Is that clear? So the general idea underlying catching up is the possibility of adopting these technologies. However, we have said that this is not immediate, okay? This is not automatic. And the possibility of benefiting from these technologies depends on how the state, the government, how the market, how the civil society could work or should work. Okay? So when we talk about catching up hypothesis, we refer mainly to some events that are, first of all, as we see, the catching up of European countries in the 19th century with respect to the UK, basically. the UK has been the first country. England was the first country that developed, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and so on. And then the other European countries, okay, catched up. The second event that is normally studied when talking about catching up is catching up by the Asian countries, okay, towards the Western world first, and then the Asian countries towards Japan. That was the first, okay, in the Asian continent to develop. Okay. So within this context, we have several contributions that I'd like to mention because they are relevant, okay, and that allow you to understand, okay, how the say, economic thinking has been evolving. The first group, let's say, of approaches that I'd like to illustrate is it's been suggested by Veblen, very well-known Norwegian American economist, and Champion, a Russian American economist. Okay. So, which is the context? This first group of approaches focused on the catching up by European countries towards England. Okay? And Veblen was among the first trying to explain the catching up, trying to explain the events, okay? Using the institutional characteristics of countries. And the idea in this case was that, of course, as we said, technologies become available and so on, but then there should be something else to try to make the technology transfer effective. And in Veblen model, okay, the explanations were related to the institutions. He was discussing the German-speaking area, okay, versus the English-speaking area. And he was emphasizing that the autocracy characterizing Germany was particularly appropriate to, let's say, devote resources, right, to the exploitation of technologies, and therefore to put in place the catching up towards the UK instead, where democracy was in place. So, this was the idea. Not saying much more. The second approach, instead, was related, or again explaining the Western European countries catching up towards England, was emphasizing the role of backwardness. Okay, so his main work is titled The Advantage of Backwardness. Okay, where the idea is that larger countries can grow quicker, okay? And therefore the more laggard countries, the quicker can grow. because there is the possibility, as we said several times, of leapfrogging. Okay, so adopting the technologies without sustaining the burden of the cost and so on and so forth. Okay. However, what he emphasized in particular was the role of the government, the role of the state. Because if you want to benefit, say, from the backwardness, you need a government that helps you, okay? First of all, to protect the new industries that you can create thanks to the new technologies. So if you remember when we talk about import protection, import tariff in order to protect national industries, okay, this is exactly what it suggests should be in place in order to help country to develop. In other words, there might be a structural change, okay, favored by the import of new technologies, but there should be protection, okay, because otherwise the new industries cannot grow. Because new industries, as we have seen, require scale, and in order to grow, they should be protected. Okay? And so the first role of the government is to protect infant industries. How? For example, via tariff. But also, the government should force savings, should force investment, and should force entrepreneurship. So, in his view, the role of government is particularly important because otherwise importing foreign technologies cannot be of any success. Okay? The second stream refer to the interpretation. Yes.
So basically, the difference with the first one is that for developing the rules and these, the development was mainly to the just the technology of introduction and
yes, but also the characteristics of the institutions that were more inclined, let's say, to, in the case of Germany, for example, to concentrate investments, to decide about investments in certain technologies. Okay, so it is emphasizing the type of institutions in Germany that is autocratic, so very centralized, while instead in the UK and England you have democracy, and so decisions is more difficult to achieve. Let's put it this way. Okay. Here is not that they suggest anything different from the previous one, where they emphasize the role of government intervention. Okay? Because as we have seen, also when we talked about the Japanese case last week, okay, where we said that the Ministry for International Trade, okay, decided which sectors to foster, which sectors to promote, okay, and then which sectors to say cancel from the country. Here, the idea is very similar. So the idea is that looking at the catching up of Asian countries, industries towards the Western first, but then within the Asian countries towards Japan, okay? The idea is that the government should decide, okay, which are the industries. And so, if you remember, we said in Japan, there was a focus in the 30s or so on industries like heavy industries, chemicals, okay? But then, in the 80s, the government decided that certain industries were not interesting anymore, deciding instead to focus on IT, knowledge-intensive industries, and therefore not only investing in the new industries, but also managing the decline of industries that were not considered interesting anymore. Okay? And that is something particularly important because sometimes in several countries, okay, when there is a focus on some industries, there is investments. But the other industries that are not considered interesting anymore, they are just left dying. Okay? While here the idea is to manage the decline, okay, avoiding waste of resources, rather than putting money in those industries that are declining and are suffering and so on. Okay. So here the suggestion is therefore to have a government, a state that is really developmental. Okay. So one of the most well-known model you might have heard about is the flying G's model. So the flying G's model has become popular, talking about basically this. So Asian countries following the lead of Japan. Okay. But when it was suggested, so in the 30s, this model was referring to a development model where the idea was similar to the others that we have seen. The idea was to first develop some industries at home, so import substituting, so developing manufacturing industries, whereas the countries was mainly agricultural, okay? So import substituting, then stimulating the growth of those industries, protecting them, reaching scale in the production, and then exporting. Okay? Is that clear? And that was the first basic pattern of this model. The second version of this flying G's model was instead the country should start with, let's say, basic products and then try to evolve them from labor-intensive product to capital-intensive product. So you start, for example, producing textiles because your labor force is cheap, but then you become the producer of textile machineries, right? So not only labor intensive, but you move to capital intensive products, okay? So this model underlines the idea of an evolution, okay? In the first basic model, import, production, export. In the second model, from simple products to complex products, from labor-intensive products to capital-intensive products, and so on. Okay. Final slide before I will highlight more on different things. Okay. This is the model suggested by Agrapis. Okay. This guy has been well known for this model that tried to explain, okay, the European catching up towards the US, where the idea was basically that Europe benefited from technologies transferred from the US. Okay. However, as we have said, it's not always easy to adopt technologies transferred from another countries. And this was also the case in Europe. Okay? They had, European countries, had to invest in order to be able to benefit from those technologies. Invest in what? First of all, in terms of competencies, in terms of skills, okay? And so they had to increase R&D expenditures, okay? In order to reduce the competence gap, because otherwise you cannot exploit advanced technologies if you do not have competencies. And this is more or less what is going on nowadays when we talk about Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. The point is the skill mismatch. Okay? So we need more skills, more competencies. And so the idea is that also here, when talking about European countries catching up with the US, so benefiting from technologies from the US, European countries had to invest, okay, in R&D, in competency, in technologies, in social capability, therefore. Okay? But at the same time, there were other aspects that made the European context more in line with those technologies that were developed in the US, that is a large market. And so those technologies were scale-intensive technologies, technologies for producing large scale of products, for example. And so what they suggest is that the European market, okay, the European Union, the European market, allowed to increase the size of the market and therefore to make this market more appropriate for the exploitation of technologies that have been developed in the US, that is a huge market. Okay? So this was the idea, talking about technological, basically, congruence and social capabilities. So here I reported what they suggest. European economic integration led to the creation of larger and more homogeneous markets in Europe, facilitating the transfer of skill-intensive technologies developed initially for the US. And also what we just said, the increase in competencies and skills. Okay? Here there are some data that you could look at. Okay? Again, in this work, there are long time series of data. Okay? So this work and these hypotheses and these approaches rely on historical data. on observations of long time series of data. Okay? And therefore, they suggest convergence or divergence, catching up or not catching up, by looking at it, okay, and try to interpret. Because in this field, as we said several times, the data really can help, can tell you what is going on. Okay? So, take-home messages, very summarized. No one size fits all. Role of formal and informal institutions. Role of industrial policy. Okay? So, these refer to the more contemporary, let's say, models that explain development versus, remember, the traditional models of international trade, okay, the comparative advantage model and so on, that instead explain, of course, the relationship between growth and development, and globalization, but in a different deterministic way. Okay? Questions? Yes.
When you said that it's important for the governments to manage the impacts of the outcome industries, how is exactly an example of how to manage the impacts of the industry?
Yes, there might be subsidies to the companies that close certain activities while open other activities. Okay, so there should be specific incentives to close some activities. Okay? And that's very important, because otherwise you have activities that are suffering and they are basically using resources in a wasteful kind of way.
For example, that for the labor force are going to be like unallocated.
Of course, the labor force should be, and this is another aspect of the managing the decline of certain industries. You should reallocate the labor forces. You should provide some education, some yes. Okay. So the very last slide for today is, as I had promised several weeks ago, some examples of questions for the test April 18. Okay, so this is just a couple of examples because some of you asked about what kind of question we find. Okay, so these are, of course, multiple choice questions. Okay, so we will have the right answer will be just one. Okay, there are no malus, so no negative points for the wrong question. Okay, and this is okay. So according to the conclusion of the neoclassical model of free trade, okay, then we have two choices. Only productive countries gain from trade. World output decreases, but GDP increases with trade. Countries will tend to specialize in products that use their abundant resources intensively. International wage rate and capital costs will gradually converge. Trade stimulates economic growth of developed countries. The market is obviously the endogenous growth theory assumes that returns to scale in production are constant, irrespectively of the selling rate, increasing due to knowledge spillovers, decreasing due to knowledge spillovers, 0, as knowledge is a public good. Right. Answer is voice. Okay. So in the endogenous growth, okay, spillovers, knowledge spillovers explain increase the growth. Okay. And then I also reported this example where you have a graph, okay, and the question is observing the figure, okay. So in this case, you have the share of global income, okay, and so you have the global top 1% and the global bottom 50%. Okay? And you have a trend in the last 30 years. Okay? And the question is, serving the figure, you can say that inequality has increased, poverty has increased, economic development has increased, the distribution of global income diverges in the recent. C is economic development has increased. Why we would say that economic development has increased? So the bottom is the poorer part of the population. And the top 1% is bottom influence. Yes?
For me, it's
Is it? A, inequality has increased. Okay? Because the richer become richer, and the poorer remains poor. Okay. And then, yes. What they need? The distribution of global income diverges in the recent period. It could mean that in the recent period there is a divergence, but it's not, because in the recent period there is not something that increases more.
But if it's not a reason for the 2005-2010, then it would be kind of correct or not?
Not really, because if you see, it's on the contrary, it's not diverging. Even if you consider this, you can see it's not diverging, it's more.
But if the moment in which the global is
In 2000, yes, 2000, 2005, 2008, okay, yes. But you should read the whole answer, no? And so the answer is the distribution of the global income diverges in the recent period. It's not true.
No, it's not.
No? So you should read the whole sentence.
Just understand that if it was correct, thinking that the global economy is increasing
Yes,
compared to the global
yes, 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 yes. Okay, and the very last one is a kind of a different type of question. This is more an exam question than a test, the intermediate test question, because there is a paragraph, okay, about China, okay, and about the consideration that China is close to cross the Lewis turning point. Okay, and so question is illustrate concept, okay, but just 3 lines, and how would it be possible to contrast the effects, okay, associated to passing the Lewis turning point. And the answer here could be increase the efficiency in the agricultural sector. So technological change in the agricultural sector. Okay. So very short answers. Okay. Any questions?
So even in the midterm exam, there will be open questions.
Yes, yes, I mentioned that. Not many. There's only one. Okay, not many. But very short. Okay. Okay. Yes.
Which topics will cover lessons up to today?
On the 13th, there will be, I think it's a lecture on the impact of global value chains on the local context, okay? So there might be one, okay, question on that. Okay, great, we managed.